It's time for the Financial Crisis Talk Center with Ken Gross and David Einstandig from Thav Gross.
Credit card debt is number one. I view it as financial cancer.
40% of your gross income is going to just pay the debt service. You got no chance of getting out. I would give up my credit score to get rid of debt.
Here's your host, Ken Gross.
Welcome back to the Talk Center. This segment of the Talk Center, we're going to talk with Sabrina Cronin from Cronin Law about money issues and in divorce. Sabrina, good to have you back in the studio.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Also sitting in with us, just in case you haven't been paying attention, is David Einstandig, Brian Small, and also Alan Zupke, who's going to be on with us in the next segment to talk about the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare. Let's talk about divorce a little bit. Now, it's not, first of all, Sabrina, your offices, I know they're in Bloomfield Hills.
Yes.
You've got a diverse background. I was kind of reading up on you again on the website. You've been an assistant prosecutor at Oakland County Prosecutor's Office.
Yes.
You were an associate attorney at Sullivan Ward and also Guerin Lukehouse, so you've got a business background as well.
Yes, I do.
Was Wally there when you were there?
Wally was there.
Wally's still there.
Yeah, he's a great man.
Wally's
He's about as old as
Yeah.
Irv King.
Wally's always been there.
Yeah, he's a great man.
I don't
Yeah.
think Irv King's with us anymore, is he?
No, he
Okay.
died 10 years ago.
All right. And your wife and
I'm a wife
mother
and
to
mother to
three
three.
wonderful children. That's
yes,
great.
thanks.
All right, so I want to talk about financial issues in divorce. Obviously, it would come as no big surprise to any of us that financial issues play into one of the causes and contributors to people getting divorced.
Absolutely.
Because financial pressures are tough issues for people to deal with. But I want to kind of jump ahead on that. In fact, you and I were over on Steve Hood's show and we were talking about that issue
Yes.
a couple weeks ago.
But ironically, sometimes that prevents people from getting a divorce because they feel as though they can't afford it.
Yeah, that's true.
So it may be the cause, but it's also the prevention in some respects.
So instead of going to marriage counselor, just rack up your credit card debt to the point where you're stuck in the marriage and everything can work out for the best.
You can't afford to get divorced.
You can't afford it,
Sabrina,
especially when you can't sell the house.
Are the numbers still what we hear, 50%, regardless of socioeconomics, across the board in the U.S. or at least in Michigan? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I've recently heard that the numbers in the younger generation they're declining, but in the older generation, they're increasing at a very fast rate.
Now, why is that?
Well,
But the younger ones haven't been married long enough
It's
to
because-
decide to get divorced.
well, because you know why? Because the millennials, they're not getting married.
They're getting married later.
They're not getting
Yeah,
married.
right.
They're living together. They're having children together, and then when they're done, they're done. But it's the older generation, the 50s, 60s that have been married for years and years and years. That there is an increase in the amount of divorces in that
Empty
generation.
nesters.
Empty nesters, the baby boomers.
Bonnie,
they're
you
getting
paying
divorced.
attention there? You listening, honey?
Enough already.
Yeah.
50s,
Yeah.
60s,
Yeah.
I think maybe you want to cook that meal one of these days.
Ken's instructions from his oven. When did you build your house? 30 years ago?
Yeah.
The instructions to the oven are still
25.
sitting in the oven.
No, actually,
Well, you
I
could be
turned-
cooking too,
Every
you
once
know.
in a while, I do.
Okay,
occasionally. I made pizzas last Sunday, and the ovens still work. Because you could blow up the whole house. If
Yeah,
you burned
because
up
you
the
didn't take the
instructions.
plastic wrap off.
I also want to talk about how financial issues actually jump into the arena once the divorce is ongoing, because you've got a lot of issues that come up that way. First of all, kind of take a look at, you got payment obligations while the divorce is pending. How is that determined? How do they come up with? How do you decide what one does a spouse entitled to support payments? Is it measured? What's the process by which that happens?
For alimony?
Interim before the divorce is finalized.
Oh, an interim support order. Well, you can definitely have a motion for an interim support, and that's done a lot of times, especially when one of the parties, particularly in most cases the woman, isn't the breadwinner and needs financial support during the pendency of the action.
Now, is there a benchmark on how that number is determined, or is it wide discretion to the judge? You have to say how much the husband's making, what the income is. How do you get to a number in that situation?
It is really what the lifestyle to to which the woman is accustomed during the course of the marriage.
Here's my question on this. Typically, isn't the essence of the order to maintain the status quo?
Yes.
Okay, if the status quo, and I think this is where Ken may be going, if the status quo is that they're running in the negative, that they're operating in the red, how do you maintain the status quo at the inception of that divorce? For example, you could have a lease payment for one of the spouses, like let's say the wife, she's got a vehicle, and there's just not enough money coming around, but that lease payment has to get paid. How do you deal with that once that divorce is filed, but not necessarily all the way down the road?
Well, it's difficult, and a lot of times the man feels so, it's so unfair to him because how can I continue to support her and the children and maintain my own lifestyle, and I'm going to be in the red if I have to pay out all this money. It's very difficult. And go ahead.
Well, status quo, what happens when that assumes, I would assume, that the parties are still residing in the same residence. How about when they separate and they're not in the same residence?
No, that's what I'm saying. Sometimes there's not enough money to go around. There's only so much money to pay all these fines and debts and costs.
So what we saw, let's say 10 years ago, where, okay, someone's getting divorced, it was still 50% people were getting divorced then. An initial, okay, we'll agree to maintain the status quo, let's move on, let's negotiate alimony, let's negotiate child support and the formulas. Now, with this financial crisis, there's got to be a lot more interaction at that initial stage and say, hey, the pot's only this big.
There has to be a lot more common sense, absolutely. And sometimes people think there's all this money, but there's not. There's all this debt. And it's very difficult to have both parties approach it in a commonsensical way.
I was going to say, there's usually not a lot of common sense floating around in the divorce emotions.
And sometimes attorneys will push it, and they just don't see, from a business standpoint, the reality of the financial situation.
If both attorneys at least approach it with a common sense approach, then you're apt to reach an agreement that's rationally based.
Absolutely.
If either client, either spouse is irrational or either attorney is irrational, then it ultimately is going to be a decision made by the judge, and it's not necessarily going to be rationally based because it's going to be the balance of lunacy versus rationality, which doesn't come to a rationality decision. It comes to somewhere in between.
And sometimes the judge doesn't understand the financial breakdown and the financial analysis that goes into, to paying for all of these debts and how and there's only so much income and it takes a lot.
We've had a huge uptick as far as I've had a number of situations where husband and wife have come in at the referral and assistance of their own divorce attorneys, and we've met with them, and this happens with second homes a lot and vacation homes, and we got to say, okay guys, you may not be getting along, you may have your divorce issues, but we got to get a plan that's going to get both of you out of this.
On that exact point, I wanted to cover a little bit later in the segment is when should the couple come in together, or when should they get separate financial advice relative to a divorce, because those are key decisions. We come back after the break. I want to talk about how we divide up assets and liabilities. Money plays in there. We'll be back after the break.
An important message if you're planning to file for Social Security disability.
The biggest problem I see is people don't go to an attorney until after the claim for disability is denied. You need to get it right the first time.
Before you file for Social Security disability, call Thav Gross.
We do the homework to make sure the claim is properly presented so that you get the benefits you deserve.
Call Thav Gross, 888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP. Call today.
You like your job. What you don't like is the way your boss has been treating you. He's making comments about how you look instead of your work, and he's been touching you inappropriately. If you complain, is he allowed to fire you? Absolutely not. Unwelcome sexual comments, advances in contact are illegal in the workplace. Make him pay. Gold Star Law is here to help you through your employment law problem, whatever it is.
Gold Star Law, protecting employees' rights. Call 1-800-WAGES-10 for a free consultation today.
Carrying too much debt? Resolve your debt. Call Thav Gross.
You don't need to be broke, and you don't need to hit rock bottom. If you have income and you're struggling with debt, dump it. Think about the next 10 or 20 years. If you do what the banks tell you, you'll have nothing to retire with. There is a solution.
Don't waste your future. Call Thav Gross. We're experts at eliminating credit card debt. 888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP.
Every family has the family meeting. And we all know what that means. Dad's got dementia. What are we going to do? What's the care plan that the family has in place? Usually they don't, or they struggle with a care plan. When you go home tonight and you talk to your tax person and you talk to your financial person, say, what's the plan that you have in place? And as soon as they don't give you an answer, give me a call, because I can do it for you.
Is the debt piling up? Struggling to get by?
It's all about preserving future income. Bankruptcy is one option. When it's right, it's the least costly, most effective way to save your home, eliminate a second mortgage, and wipe out credit card debt. But you need to address the problem now.
We help people with bankruptcy. Call the experts.
We're Thav Gross. Our firm will solve your problem.
888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP.
All right, welcome back. We're talking with Sabrina Cronin from Cronin Law about divorce and money issues. And while we were at the break and you guys were all talking, Alan, who's going to be with us in the next segment talking about insurance, I had a great idea. How about selling insurance against divorce? You go in, you get married, you buy an insurance policy that says you get $100,000 if you get divorced. Do you think there's a market for that?
I think there is.
Yeah, what's the premium?
The premium is
$100,000. There you go. All right, now let's back to the reality check. So we've got assets and liabilities have to be divided up into a divorce. And how is let's assume you have a normal property division where you're not assailing greater blame on one of the house spouses relative to maybe abuse or extramarital affairs or something. It's going to be a 50-50 split. That's the norm, right?
Right.
All right. How do you decide assets and liabilities? Is it 50-50 at the bottom line? One side takes some assets, one side takes some liabilities, so they have a net number. The other side gets some assets, gets some liabilities, and they have a net number. And are the two net numbers supposed to be equal? Is that the goal?
Typically, I mean, that's the idealistic way to approach it.
Yeah. So
it doesn't always work that way, but everything's negotiable. In alimony, it's negotiable. Child support is not necessarily negotiable.
Oh, sure, because that's going to be an ongoing obligation of whoever's obligated to pay support for the child, regardless of their assets and liabilities.
Correct.
Right?
With regard to alimony, though, how often do you find that the court is just ready to only look at what the alimony guidelines, whether they be the prognosticator guidelines or the Washtenaw guidelines, which are a separate type of guideline?
I sense Brian knows
alimony.
a little bit about divorce here.
I think he knows a lot about it, actually.
Would you say the antagonist guidelines or the protagonist?
No,
what did you say?
Prognosticator. Yeah, you got a good point there. No, there's two schools of thought in Michigan. One is called the Washtenaw guidelines, and the other is the prognosticator. And many attorneys use one or the other, and they have different benefits and different results. And I think actually the Washtenaw guidelines are more complete analysis, although most attorneys don't like the result of the Washtenaw guidelines unless you are the
Is there a question in there somewhere?
Well, I'm just wondering how you're finding what the courts are doing these days. Do they just rubber stamp them, or are they actually letting you get better results than the guidelines suggest?
Are you referring to alimony, spousal support?
Yeah.
Better results? Oftentimes I find that spousal support is so negotiable between the attorneys, obviously in the parties, that again, the commonsensical approach, as we discussed, I think it proves to be better when the attorneys work it out than if the judge were to decide it. Judges oftentimes, if they're looking at spousal support, they do go more toward the prognosticator guidelines, in my experience, than the other, the Washtenaw. I don't see those being used as much in Oakland County, that is.
Sabrina, in the past, we used to have the marital home, and let's say there was a 30-year mortgage on it, and then there's a divorce, and there would be language in the divorce judgment that said one spouse will quit claim their interest to the other spouse, and then the spouse that is going to be remaining in the property will then go refi the obligation, so the other spouse is no longer obligated on that promissory note and that mortgage-backed obligation. That was great, and it worked great when there was equity in
I was gonna
the
say.
home, and there was the ability to refi. But let's talk reality. We've got low interest rates for many years now, so we've got a lot of long-term fixed rates out there, but we got 50% of the people getting divorced. How do you deal with the situation where there's no way on earth that there can be a refi?
When that other party cannot refinance, it makes it very difficult. And we have to put language in the judgment that gives time for the party to be able to refinance down the road.
Or at least
causes,
they'll use best efforts or reasonable efforts.
Yes.
And I've dealt with the situation on and again. But if you're not cognizant at the time that you're negotiating that divorce judgment, it could be
It could be
it
fatal.
could cost a lot of money down the road.
Yes, and
it
oftentimes the
gets
parties
worse,
and
yeah.
oftentimes the parties stay in the same house even after they're divorced because no one can afford to move out. They can't afford to pay the note on the house. They can't afford either to pay rent or another, house payment or whatever the situation may be.
To me, there's always a fatal outcome. If the house is way underwater, and the parties think, well, we can't afford, the spouse wants to stay, the wife wants to stay in the house with the kids because there's no way of getting her into a new house in their financial circumstance. So they function on the idea we have to make an agreement with the house, and then it puts the onus on that spouse to refi the house down the road when it's never going to be refiable. What ends up happening is after the divorce at some point in time, assuming the house is still underwater, which most of the houses, if your house was $150,000 underwater in 2010, it's still underwater now. It may not be 150 underwater, it may only be 85 underwater if things are going well for you, but it's still way underwater. In that situation, the outcome is always a problem post-divorce because the spouse comes and says, I want to short sell the house.
Well,
and
they come to me
us,
and they say
file
I want to
bankruptcy.
file a bankruptcy, and I have to give them some really bad news. That property settlement, if they qualify for a Chapter 7, is non-dischargeable. So that little provision where you decided to take the house and hold your spouse harmless is about like putting a bullet in the gun. And
Yeah, I
pulling the trigger.
wanted to back you up a little bit on that. Is how these things end up coming out. And Sabrina, correct me if I'm wrong, or let me know if I'm right. Is you end up with an agreement. One spouse says they'll indemnify the other spouse from any liability in the house, and they'll promise to refi within X number of years. That spouse then goes to file a bankruptcy, goes to Brian. We have to say to her, you know what? You can discharge your obligation to Bank of America in the bankruptcy, but you can't discharge your obligation under the divorce judgment to your spouse because that's a property settlement obligation that's non-dischargeable in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy.
Absolutely.
So what does that mean
That's
in
right.
English? That the spouse can always go back for indemnification from the other,
So
regardless
let's,
of a Chapter 7?
I'll give you a simple
Yes.
example. You owe $150,000 on the house. You've agreed to hold harmless and you take responsibility for the house. Subsequently, you can't afford it. You file bankruptcy. The house is foreclosed. There's a $50,000 deficiency. They're going back. The bank is going to go after the spouse that didn't keep the house. When that
because
happens,
they're still on the note.
and that happens, the spouse
Has indemnification rights.
can come back against the wife or the other spouse and sue to recover money.
And worse yet, if you have a situation where the person in the house wants to short sale, and then the bank will let them out, but the other spouse, out of spite, will not sign off, that could be a problem.
Yes.
You got a lot of tough issues. We're coming up on a break. I want to talk a little bit about retirement funds, and then I want to run a couple scenarios by you that will take us through the end of the segment. We'll be back after the break.
Thank you.
Do you have tax problems, unfiled returns? Facing levies on wages in your property? You need an expert, not a cartoon character or salesman. Thav Gross is your solution.
You need to look at the big picture. That's what we do. We develop a plan that's right for you.
I had major tax problems. I didn't know what to do.
You need to address the problem now. Call the experts.
We're Thav Gross. Our firm will solve your problem.
888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP.
Going from hourly to salary seemed like a good career move, but now you're working 60 hours a week instead of 40, and you aren't getting paid any of that extra time. You're stuck, right? Wrong. You can be on salary and still be entitled to overtime. If you've been wrongly denied such pay, you may be entitled to that and more. Gold Star Law is here to help you through your employment law problem, whatever it is.
Gold Star Law, protecting employees' rights. Call 1-800-WAGES-10 for a free consultation today.
If you're retired and in a financial crisis, there is a way out.
It pains me when I see a retired couple exhaust their savings by paying credit card bills and for a home hopelessly underwater.
Thav Gross specializes in helping retired people in financial crisis.
You just can't keep paying until you're broke. You need to address the problem now.
888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP.
We're Thav Gross. Our firm will solve your problem.
Every family has the family meeting, and we all know what that means. Dad's got dementia. What are we going to do? What's the care plan that the family has in place? Usually they don't, or they struggle with a care plan. When you go home tonight and you talk to your tax person and you talk to your financial person, say, what's the plan that you have in place? And as soon as they don't give you an answer, give me a call, because I can do it for you.
An important message if you're planning to file for Social Security disability.
The biggest problem I see is people don't go to an attorney until after the claim for disability is denied. You need to get it right the first time.
Before you file for Social Security disability, call Thav Gross.
We do the homework to make sure the claim is properly presented so that you get the benefits you deserve.
Call Thav Gross, 888-235-HELP. That's 888-235-HELP. Call today.
All right, welcome back. We're with Sabrina Cronin. We're talking about divorce and money issues. I want to do a couple quick announcements. I want to thank our sponsors, Gold Star Law, Samasco Law, Elite REO Services, Alan Stalter, coming on board, Cardiology Associates of Michigan. Also a little shout out to our gift certificate sponsors, Johnny Pomodoros and Detroit Popcorn. With seminars coming up, we'll post it. We've talked about it at the beginning of the first segment. If you're watching on the TV, the date and time of the seminars will be posted on a slide. Seminars are a real good opportunity of addressing financial issues. To sign up for them, you go to thavgross.com or financialcrisistalkcenter.com. You enter the data. We mail you the tickets to the seminar. You get a free copy of my book, Dump Your Debt. People enjoy the seminars. They spend a lot of Q&A at the end of the seminar. Generally speaking, the comments that we get are always from the seminar kind of enlightening from the standpoint of it's not about, the focus is not about bankruptcy per se. The focus is much broader based on the notion that if you have good income, but you're carrying too much debt, you're leveraging your future to disaster. You're putting yourself on a road towards no money for retirement. And it's really, the focus is a long-term play. And that's what we're a short-term society, but in your financial interests, you need to look long-term in order to look out for what happens when you're 70, 75. I can tell you this much. When I was 25, I thought 40 was ancient. I said, by 40, I'll be done. I'll be retired. I'll be living on an island. Everything will be so easy. I couldn't fathom the notion that I would one day be crossing the road to 60, worrying about how much money I'm going to have, whether I'm going to have to work to 98 or whether I'm going to only have to work to 92 in order to make ends meet. But 99% of us end up in that. Actually, you want to end up in that boat because you don't want to be one of the ones. Not too many of them become the billionaire by 40. A lot of them drop off and and kick the bucket in their 50s and 60s. You don't want that outcome. You want to live to 90, but you want to have income to live off of. Anyway, back to divorce. Let's talk about fun things. Sabrina, on retirement funds, there's this term quadro. What is a quadro? The dollar amount determined that one spouse gets of the other person's retirement fund?
Quadro stands for the Qualified Domestic Relations Order. It's an order that's put into place upon divorce that entitles one spouse to get the other spouse's retirement amount. Because the philosophy or the theory behind it is during the course of the marriage, that money would have otherwise come into the marital home, but instead it was getting saved for retirement.
So it's kind of a marital asset.
It's a marital asset,
so
yes.
So when they figure out an amount, like a present value of it, And is that asset amount, that amount taken into account when we're dividing up assets and liabilities?
Yes, it's looked at. It can be looked at in several different ways depending on how the negotiations take place. It can be looked at as alimony, spousal support. It can be looked at the marital asset. Typically, what happens is if one of the spouses had a pot at the onset of the marriage, that money doesn't necessarily get included.
Then it kind of gets siphoned
it's set
off
aside. Yes, it's the amount that was accrued during the course of the marriage.
Okay, here's what I want to kind of wrap up on the segment with conceptually, because when you touched on it earlier, David, is the idea of when people should look for financial advice together versus separate in the heat of the battle. Now, let me give you one scenario. Suppose husband's in a divorce, and there's assets, and there's $150,000 of credit card debt. The wife's sitting there saying, I don't want this credit card debt, I want a support payment. Husband's saying, you know what? I'll take the Range Rover that's paid free and clear. I'll take a bigger share of the of the value of my retirement. We'll pay you less out of that, honey. And I'll take on all the credit card debt. So that at the end, the scale is we're each getting 50-50. I'm taking more assets and more debt. You're getting less debt and virtually no assets. Conceptually, that says, well, there's some rationality there. But what if the husband's already gone in on the sly and met with Brian Small, super debt reliever, and Brian has said to him, you know, you can do that. You come back afterwards. We either could do debt resolution on all the credit cards and get rid of them, or we could do a bankruptcy. Now, Brian would say, can't really do a bankruptcy because if the wife isn't released from the debt, you got problems.
Actually,
with the
Brian
supporter.
would say that we probably can do a bankruptcy.
Chapter 13.
We would do a Chapter 13. Property settlement is non-dischargeable in Chapter 7, but it is dischargeable in Chapter 13. I actually do a lot of advising to divorce attorneys around town, and I set up divorce judgments for the purpose of filing Chapter 13 afterwards.
So the whole point here is this: if you're in the divorce, you've got to be very careful. Sometimes husbands and wives are getting divorced and they're working through the process together in a smart way. There, it makes sense to sometimes come in and say, how do we deal with these debts together, and what's the fair outcome? But if you're not on the same page with each other, if it's one of these acrimonious divorces, not uncommon, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. I don't know that joint counseling isn't really what it's about, but you better be aware that your spouse may be getting some financial advice of how he's going to handle it post-bankruptcy. So you need to watch out for yourself in that analysis. That's what, I was thinking, hey, take the Range Rover, I'll take the thing, I'll take the credit card debt, and then I'll just go settle all the credit card debt using debt resolution or a bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. You like that, huh, Brian?
I do. And Sabrina likes that too, because we've been doing a lot of chatting about divorce and bankruptcy strategies, and most divorce attorneys recognize that there's a lot of commingling with the thoughts there.
Right,
so
we're out of time, and I don't want to forget. If you want to reach Sabrina, you can go to her website, call CroninLaw.com, or call 855-CALL-CRONIN.
That's right. Thank you so much.
Sabrina, thanks for being on the show. We'll have
My
you
pleasure.
back again soon.
Thank you.
We will be back with another segment of the Financial Crisis Talk Center.